All right. Yeah. So happy Friday, y'all. Thanks for coming back after session 1 and session 2. It's happy to see y'all came back actually for session 3.
Happy Friday.
Yeah. Let me get this screen shared. All right. So part 3, the finale. This is going to be the more technical of the 3. We're going to go over strategic DDD. And we're going to cover the bounded context topic that we missed last time. And then we're going to go into more tactical DDD. So actually reflecting the model in the code, like techniques for doing that. So getting to the nitty gritty. It's going to provide you with some object patterns and some design guidelines around that. So that's what we're going over today. And my conclusion. But before, I just want to recap. Last time we learned about the ubiquitous language as the backbone, being model driven, domain exploration through knowledge crunching, and we're going to do this today. All right, so starting with the bounded context. Well, a quick blurb on strategic DDD. That's just DDD's way of looking at the big picture. We talk about design a lot and, at the code level, application level, but this is an architectural design discipline as well. Yeah. So in terms of strategic design, they talk about context, distillation, and large scale structure. Just to touch on that really quick, distillation is all about extracting the core the core domain from the many subdomains. I'm not going to go into that. Large scale structure is about having a set of system-wide rules, conventions, workflows, and patterns. A system metaphor being one of those. Olivia's heard me talk about that before. And another one would be something called evolving order, which is just saying that the design is evolutionary. But let's get right into bounded context. So bounded context is one of those terms that people get confused, but it's really a simple term. It's more literal than you would think. It basically means bounded means what? Encapsulated, protected, it's walled off. And the context is just an area of meaning. That's all it is really. So in any big system, you'll have different areas of the system that mean different things. And that's all a context is. The bounded context pattern is saying we should wall those off. We shouldn't just leave them in this one big. We should extract each context, and that's all it's saying. It's about decomposition. Again, that divide and conquer principle. And what dictates the context is the language, the model that's being used. But we're gonna jump into an analogy here. Here's domain-driven large-scale decoupling and cohering is like cell division. So we're going back to biology, like high school biology here. But let's say these two centrosomes are two meanings of the same word. So the same term, different nuance. It starts to cause complication in that existing context. It starts to split some more, and the code starts to get a little messier until it turns into this. It's not really this. It's really, another phase. But from a code perspective, it turns into a big ball of mud. And then developers are like, let's split it up. So they split it up, and we end up with two separate bounded contexts. So this is the whole idea of it. So we have separate meanings in different bounded contexts. Now, this could be the same exact word, same exact term, same exact phrase, but different context. But now you have clear context and you don't have that confusing mess up here. That's the analogy. Now let's bring it, let's say, here's an example of a bank account. Let's say I have a bank and they want to model a bank account. So they start with a naive model. That's what they call it. It's just the initial model that gets them going, right? So it's first just a checking and savings account. At some point, the business shifts and says, now we want a personal and business account. Usually what happens is devs will go in and try to stick personal and business into the same bank account. And literally, you kind of have this, the equivalent of this fusion of the two. But the idea is don't force fit it. You'll create the ticking time bomb again. This is a little better, right? Where you say, all right, now we're going to intelligently integrate personal and business into check-ins and savings. But again, this only, it's a better implementation, but it still leads to this over time. Sad face. This is where we want to go, right? So we have check-ins and savings. It's separate bounded context. Personal business, separate bounded context. So there's no confusion between the two.
I'm okay, hold on. My brain went in 5 different places, but I'm going to ask, maybe jumping ahead, like a more technical question.
Yep.
So like in this case, right?
Yep.
How much do you literally separate in the code to represent these bounds?
So to rephrase, is your question, what are these boundaries kind of made of in the code? Or
Yeah. And how much can you like reuse between them? Yeah.
Right. That's the whole idea. We'll see. I have another example. Maybe it'll shed some light into the answer to that. But that's a great question. Here's another example. Right? So in Cyberstar. Now, this is just an example. I don't know if this is actually going to happen. But if and when KSATs and qualifications meanings start to diverge. Now, I just picked KSATs and qualifications. It could be any term within Cyberstar. This is just for example. It could be qualifications. It could be position, whatever the case may be. Let's say they start to diverge. What should happen? Well, what could happen, right? So for example, in the foundation subdomain, this is literally what will happen. You'll have a KSAT, and let's say this is not an accurate model, but for illustration purposes, let's say it has a position on it. When the academy, when we start implementing things for academy, and we'll say, let's put it into foundation, for example. But now the academy model has a concept of a learning plan. So now we'll stick a learning plan attribute onto the existing KSAT. Now it has learning plan and position. So one of the attributes are from this context, and one of the attributes are from this academy subdomain. So you have this weird coupling of context on the same exact software element. So ideally, you'll separate them out. And even though they still seem to mean the same thing, the foundation KSAT should not know anything about a learning plan. So this KSAT shouldn't know about a learning plan over here. But in this context, the KSAT does. Again, if we don't separate the context, we might be able to design in such a way where we can have a learning plan, courses, and tuition integrated among work roles, proficiency, position, but that'll add complexity to to that single domain. Complexity makes it hard to understand, hard to maintain, hard to test, et cetera, et cetera. That's the whole idea behind bounded context. Now this might answer your question, Olivia, but let's see. So what are these boundaries made of? Well, the guideline is that developers need to easily know which bounded context they're in. And so, of course, like I said before, the UL and the model, they start off setting the boundaries. But concretely, it'll be separate applications, code bases, repositories, separate database schemas, and on the people side, separate teams, right? Ideally, so again, if you go back to the guideline, there'll be no mistake which context I'm in, right? However, yeah, go ahead.
I should raise my hand. That's what I should do so that I'm not just like interrupting.
Interrupt because I'm looking over here, so please.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair. So this is almost like when you have those bounded contexts, it's almost like an integration with yourself.
Tell me more about that. Integration with
yeah. So you were talking about like academy and foundation. There certainly is some overlap, and you'll want to be able to pass information between those two.
Yes.
But in editing or, that sort of thing, it's still two separate.
Yes. Here's the thing. So good point. So let's go back up here. So there will be commonalities between the two, and they will need to exchange data. These could be any two. These are just examples, but realistically, one bounded context needs info from another one and vice versa. The thing is, when they're combined, it's very difficult to know what that communication path is. And
then you get into like, hey, it's this field or schema is used for XYZ purposes over here, but we're also trying to use it for this, and so then that's where you get that entanglement because you're trying to use it for multiple purposes. But the separation can help you avoid a more complex thing for multiple purposes.
Exactly.
Okay.
And to put it in in DDD's terms, it makes the implicit explicit. When it's inside, that communication is implicit. Which context am I in? And it's like it depends on like this tacit knowledge from like this developer might have memorized the entire context, and they know the nuances and they know the pathways, but it's not obvious where they are. Okay, tacit knowledge, right? It's not obvious where those connections, where those separation, where those seams are, because they're implicit. So it's easy to overstep them, easy to violate them, and get things confused. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anybody else want to follow up on that? We have a little more wiggle room today in terms of time. So
I had something, Drew.
Yeah, what's up, man?
I think I guess one of the things that you were touching on is like, hey, we have all these things in these domains and they're all coupled together. And I think that when you're writing software, that tends to be the natural thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when you're going to write stuff, you're like, hey, I know how this is all going to work. I know how it's all going to interact. And so you write a shortcut and it says, hey, look, that's how all of this stuff is related.
Yeah.
And you say, okay, when we use a case add, it's going to be used like this. When we use a qualification, it's going to be used like this. Hey, when we, and it at first glance, you say, man, I have really, really made this convenient. I've made it easy to use. But what happens later on when you get a 8140 and it's a little different is all your shortcuts now become a little convoluted, and you end up with code that starts to work around things. And I guess I was just saying all that to say, Olivia touched on like code reuse or was that what she said, or something like that?
Yes.
And I just want to emphasize, and I know that this isn't always what developers think. They always think dry, right? Don't repeat yourself, right? Like they want to have this code that if we have the same code in multiple places, that's bad. So we have to encapsulate it and da 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 da.
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy to fall into a dry pattern that convolutes these boundaries.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm saying I've concretely seen that here in this code base.
Oh yeah.
And so like that's why I'm drawing it out here is like one of those things. It's like, hey, we don't want to call this every time we do this other thing, and we encapsulate it, but we encapsulate it in the wrong way.
Right.
So it could be done in a way that is very functional, where it's like, hey, we have this one thing that takes a KSAT and it performs these actions on them, but instead we end up sticking it on classes that get coupled together.
Yep. And that happens when you put reuse up before something like testability, simplicity, clarity. Reuse comes after these. So you make it work, make it right, then make it fast, reusable, optimized for whatever else.
Yep.
When you put reuse first or performance first, is it testable? Can you change it easily? You know, that's where it becomes a problem.
Exactly.
Chris, you have your hand raised. What's up, man?
Well, I'm debating if I want to ask, but I'll ask.
Ask.
I can't hear you very well, Chris. I don't know if you're quiet for everybody else.
Yeah, pretty low.
That's because I have to yell at my Mac for it to update my volume. Hi, how's it going? Is it better now?
That's better.
You just sound angry now.
Yeah, well, I'm mad at the Mac. Oh, it's Mac OS, man. Every time. Anyway, so this would probably negate the use of in the object-oriented world. Probably would negate the use of like interfaces and polymorphism, I guess, right? Especially if they're separate code bases, that would definitely happen.
I think I see where you're getting at. Things like, well, you know, there's this type of KSAT and there's another type of KSAT. I would say, remember this example down here, right? So this is much better than this. And I think what you're saying is you can design it in such a way where you remove some of the implicit differences and you can express the variations between certain terms, like, okay, this is a business checking account, this is a personal checking account, and you could do things like that. So the answer is not. There's definitely a place for it. The thing is, if you try to, at some point, this is still looming, because the problem is that there are two models that are trying to live in the same context, and eventually that'll come back to bite you, because there's only so much you can do with polymorphism. I don't even want to say inheritance, but you know, composition, things like that, to fight the momentum of the two models growing separately. So that's going to overpower the design, is what I'm saying, according to DDD guidelines. So if it's truly model driven, you follow the model. If the model is starting to split, you start to split the design. I'm getting a thumbs up, so I think that means good. Oh yeah, 100%, Brandon. A lot of language features make us do the wrong thing regarding good design. Absolutely, language features, frameworks. We'll go over that in a second. But yeah, so going back to the walls, these are what define the boundaries of each context, because without these, it's still kind of, cloudy and this fuzzy idea of, different understanding over here, different understanding, but what's actually holding the understanding? And it's applications, database, separation of teams, CI/CD pipelines might be different, release cadences might be different. These are the things that create the boundaries. For our context, these are important as well. Security policies. I'm thinking like project host, right? I'm thinking IL5. They give us, other constraints we have to deal with. Central API comes to mind real quick. The bridge API. One has to live in a different environment technically than the other one. So those are two separate bounded contexts, right? Due to things like these. All right. So the whole idea is to break up a big ball of mud. Without doing this, it turns into this real fast. And it just leaves me with a question. I wonder how many contexts live in Cyberstar Foundation right now. I don't know. Maybe it's the one. Maybe there's 3 different ones. Maybe it's compliance tracking, reporting. Maybe there's other ones that Chris hasn't called out yet. But it just makes me think. What models live inside just Foundation in and of itself? All right.
Well,
you didn't want actual answers.
Oh, I can. It's rhetorical, but please, if you got answers to that, because Chris gave me those 3, and I keep repeating those 3 because I'm like, yes, I got some decomposition. But yeah, please, if you had some.
Well, your example of the 8140.
Yep.
Right, tying ourselves to 8140 is actually the one that like pops front of mind for me, because there might be a time when we want to go after DIB, and DIB is delayed / doesn't have 8140. They're interested in NICE framework. So, I think in general, decoupling compliance from framework specific things, from policy specifics, can be really helpful. But
Yeah.
also, I don't know how our code looks. And
no, I think, those 3 things that I called out, tracking, compliance, and reporting, those I think could eventually become, and those are already separate domains, I think, or contexts, maybe.
Separate context within the same
domain, yeah.
Same subdomain.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and so, and I've kind of advocated like the same thing that Olivia said, of like decoupling it from a particular policy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the rules engine started kind of birthing out of that. But I think, separating out tracking and reporting is something that would definitely need to entertain moving forward. I think. Yeah.
Okay. No, good point. Ever since you mentioned those 3, they've been kind of burned in my brain. I keep referencing those 3. Okay, good. So we got bounded contexts. All right, so let's get a little bit more nerdy. A little bit more nerdy now, guys. A little bit more codey. Finally going to talk about some design guidelines at a high level and on the object level. I should say at the application level and object level. Starting off with design guidelines. So Evans calls it supple design, or how to reach a supple design. And he calls out 7 guidelines. I'm not going to go over all 7 because I think these get really, like, I don't understand these extremely well enough to simplify it and talk about them. And I think they're kind of abstract. However, these are really important and easier for me to explain. Standalone class, I think it's the most important one. Here we're talking about using small, simple, independent classes wherever we can. And recognizing that the concepts map to the classes or the objects. So the concepts in our domain, the things that we talk about, if they're crisp, again, that word Chrisby,
So
our classes will follow. And vice versa. So if we have this God class that has 50,000 attributes and 50,000 methods, how do we talk about that class? It's going to be
negatively.
negatively,
That's how we do it.
or just not. Yeah, or you just don't talk about it.
Yeah, sweep it under the rug.
Same thing.
That's definitely effective.
Right. And the idea is to realize that classes map directly to concepts. The simpler you could keep a concept, the simpler you could keep the code. And what are the kinds of dependencies we're trying to remove from classes? So we're just talking about attributes, fields, method parameters, method return values, local variables, and methods.
Man, I tell you, that users table in ATCTS is like just an example of the complete opposite of this.
The opposite of this, right?
Oh my gosh, it's got like 70, 80 columns on it and like columns of different functions. It's like everything's tied into it. It's such a freaking nightmare.
Yeah. I've seen it. And look at position. Not to pick on this. I don't know. I just picked a random class based on what we're talking about, and position came up, and it's like
it's probably, you're probably, throwing down the gauntlet, just fighting words, that kind of thing. But go ahead.
I'm not trying. I don't got beef with nobody, right? No beef, but
Totally giving you a hard time, man. Come on, it's fine.
It says Amber was the last person to touch that, so I mean that's probably all her fault.
I mean, I did nothing with it whatsoever, so I got absolutely no skin in the game, which is why I'm just like totally muddying the water.
I didn't check who the author. I didn't check. I just picked a class, and it's like, how can I begin to speak about what position is as a concept?
First, you have to act as paranoid.
I have to act as paranoid at first, whatever that is, and we know what that is because of tacit knowledge. But and then we have long methods. I think this is a 200 and change long class, which is not that bad, but the long methods in it, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to go for smaller methods, and I'll give you examples of those smaller classes. The other concept is intention revealing interfaces. I translate this as good names. There's, of course, Evans gives a much more philosophical explanation, but basically the names are what connects the model to the design. Names. So sometimes people don't want to spend a lot of time on naming things well, and sometimes you don't have enough information to name a thing well. So, and those are both fair points, but again, the names are what connects the model. So go into it with our eyes wide open if we don't use a good enough name, or we don't give it the attention that's deserved. Yeah, Brandon says you can be far too specific and far too vague very easily. Absolutely. Naming is hard. Naming is one of the biggest problems in design. But the idea is if I can look at a name and begin to tell what the effect of changing the internals will be, it's a decent name. When I look at a name and it doesn't clue me in as to the significance of the object, or like changing the object, it's time to improve the name. So that's intention revealing interfaces. There's a whole section that he devotes to this topic. Side effect free functions is the third thing. Very important as well. Be deliberate about command versus query. So a command is something like, it's a method with no return value that performs some side effect. So it changes some state outside of the scope of the method. So there's no return. You fire it off and it does something over there that you got to go find out.
Yeah,
it changes the state.
That makes me nuts, man.
Right? So side effect free functions, he's not saying don't ever code something that has a side effect. That's probably impossible. But make it explicit. That's what this is saying. And so when a function's behavior is explicitly determined by its params and reflected in its return value, that's a side effect free function. If the function mixes logic with state change, split it into two separate operations. One for command, one for the query or the function.
Yes.
And again, that's for clarity's sake, and that's to avoid confusion of what's happening. Code is much easier to understand when you separate the two. Sorry, were you going to say something, Chris?
No, I was just gonna. I was gonna say I like you too much to take you on a tour of ATCTS, dude. I just don't think that would be a good use of your time. But I mean, it just. I mean, I go back to that just because I've spent 7 years in it. But
Yeah.
you know, I was attempting to kind of pull some things out and do some of this stuff. So
Yeah.
I guess this is just me verbalizing my trauma.
Yeah. I've been there, man. Trust me, I've been there, and I've written a lot of it in my career. Like, I've written a lot of that code, and I will write more of that code. It's just I know a little better, so hopefully I could do better. So assertions kind of help you make side effects explicit. And they also, so they take the form of things like exceptions, guard clauses at the beginning of your method, and tests. You can make assertions on tests. So you can do things like assert certain preconditions and assert, yeah, rap album will have the explicit rating, right? Make the implicit
Right.
explicit.
Yep.
I like it. So let's say I have a command and it has, there are certain preconditions and post conditions. I can assert on those in a test, right? So I make it explicit that way, right? So there's nothing, there's no spooky action from a distance happening in the code base if I use assertions. So that's the idea there. With the other three, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because, as said before, they're a little bit abstract. So I'm going to move on to the concrete object patterns next.
So do you just back on assertions? I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like this right here is the reason why we couldn't really write a test for that compliance core.
Oh, one of them. This is one of the reasons we couldn't.
Because you know it required, it was this tons of side effects going on. You had to set up this massive amount of things before you could even write a test, you know?
Exactly.
Yep.
Massive amount of state. Yeah. Sorry.
Drew, I want to say one other thing. So this is like one of those things where it's like, hey, pass in this vendor and then go update their invoices. And right, like side effect free code wouldn't look up the vendor. If it's missing data, go query this other thing and then update this other thing. And then like it would do all that up front. It would, perform these exception testing or guards, right? It would say, hey, look, do I have this thing? Okay, kick this record out. Do I have this thing? Okay, go process the record. And it wouldn't say like change tenants under the hood and then go get some other data and then update the original tenant because it knew how.
Right.
So
yeah, I see where you're going. We're going to get to a pattern called aggregates.
Yep.
And that's going to touch on this point. So remember this point.
I think it's one of those things that's really difficult though, because most people don't think about orchestrating. I'm including myself in this. Most people don't think about this orchestration layer well until you've like found a problem with the code that you're running and you're like, wait a second, why is this going out and calling this thing? when we're trying to da 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 da, and it's easy, like you're like, oh well, because some people have this status and the other people we infer it from the other record, and the other people we have to fall back to a default, right?
Yep.
And it sounds like it makes sense at the time, but these are all these things that have all these side effects that end up breaking when you go to run them in real life.
Yep. And there's more to that too. We'll get into, I think that's the next thing I'm going to talk about, layering. But again, side effect free, I mean, it's just determined by this. Like whatever I pass in, I could look at the signature and know everything I need to know about the function. I could look at the return value and the parameters and say, oh, that's what this thing is doing. If I can't do that, if it's doing something else, that's when it gets spooky, and nobody likes to work with code like that. All right, the next topic addresses a lot of the problems. Well, I think most of the problems we talked about in some way, and I think it's our entry point into improving our apps, and it's one of the fundamental things to do when starting up a new app. So we're talking about spawning central API, spawning bridge, spawning maybe even something for the scraper Adam and I have been looking at. And it's like, we want to start it off with layering. So the building blocks are these 8 object patterns. And these objects, so the question of, okay, yeah, we've talked about DDD feedback loop. We've talked about the model. We've talked about being model driven. So how exactly do I get that model that we all share a model now? Good. So how do I get that into the code? And basically, these are the nuts and bolts of how to do it. These patterns. So the most important, in my opinion, is the layered architecture. So I think we're all familiar with clean architecture. That's Robert Martin's description. Ports and adapters is another one. Hexagonal architecture is another one. MVC is another one, model view controller. DDD's layered architecture basically is a representation of all these, where the principle or the primary goal with layered architecture is to protect the model. Protect the model, protect the model, protect the model. So those model objects that we're going to talk about need to be protected. So there's a style called Smart UI that they call out, which all this means is that it's the simplest version of layering that you can do in your app. So let's say you have a new Rails app, new Go app, new Java app, wherever it is, right? You'll have that model that you understand, and you want to protect that model. So that'll form one layer. That let's say it's a folder, right? Or I don't want to say folder because that's misleading, but it's a group of classes that represent the model, and everything else would be the second layer. So whether we're talking about UI, application classes, infrastructure, that'll be in wherever it is, as long as the model is protected. So that's what Smart UI is saying. It's the simplest version of layering. It's simpler than MVC because this is just saying, I just care about the model. Whatever else, do whatever else. This is DDD's call out. So it's like you have a UI, and this is just mine, the Neapolitan cake, but I had to add that. I'll talk about this more down here. So this is the diagram, the infamous DDD layering diagram. Now to break this down, your user interface layer, everyone kind of knows what that's your view objects, that's your front end. Let's say this represents our Rails app, right? A backend app. On the application layer, we have things like controllers, input validators, translators, coordinators, orchestrators, right? That functionality lives on this layer. And concretely, you can look at something like a user controller or position controller. All these should really do is this type of logic, which is not really business logic. It's more just it's application logic. It's coordination logic. In your domain, now this is where you have your value objects, your entities, and all your model objects that we'll go over. You'll have your position model, user model, etc., and you'll have your repositories. Now I'm going to talk about repositories. It's probably not what you're thinking, because if you follow a lot of frameworks, or if you go by a lot of frameworks or languages, it's not giving you the DDD repository. And we'll talk about repository in the next session. And then you have your infrastructure layer. So this would be your database, your framework, your external services, even something like in Java, it's called system.out. That's login to the console. In Rails, it's put, or in Ruby, it's put. But that's hooked to your console. So that's an external service, which is the infrastructure. And it's cross-cutting, which means it affects every part, every other layer, right? The infrastructure layer is a layer that every other layer potentially knows about, which is not a bad thing, right? That's where frameworks come in handy, actually. And let's go over that now. So the key to this whole layering is that, again, the domain layer is protected. And this is how you protect the domain layer. Objects in one layer depend only on and know only about objects in lower layers. Notice that the arrows going down, none of the arrows point back up. So a domain object doesn't know anything about the controller. It shouldn't make a call to a controller or any view objects, but the opposite can happen. If you notice, none of these know about the view. That's another thing. None of these objects know anything about or care anything about the view or the user interface level. Key thing to point out here is the model objects only know about your infrastructure. So I'll illustrate this with dependency injection later on. But the idea, again, is this is how these model objects are protected in a nutshell. There are other more advanced things, like in clean architecture, it says you should always depend on an abstraction, which I'm not going to get into that. That's a little bit in the weeds. But everybody kind of understand the basic idea of protecting this domain layer from application and the others. All right, thumbs up. Cool. And this is the thing I see. I don't see a clear representation of this in our code base, and I think it causes a lot of issues, especially between the domain and infrastructure. Their database calls happening in the domain layer directly. That's infrastructure stuff. So there's circular dependencies happening in these two layers, especially, but also up here in all three. That wouldn't happen if we had a little bit, more sophisticated layering. Chris?
Okay, so you touched on something that kind of made me wonder.
Yeah.
You mentioned database queries being called in the domain area or the model.
Yep.
If the infrastructure, when you say database framework, like, okay, I'm thinking like from an MVC standpoint.
Yep.
Where would you put a query?
Right. So that would be in your infrastructure.
So what would be a practical expression of that?
All right. We will, I think I have an example. So a practical expression would be this. So this repository object, so in DDD, well, I'll kind of get to that in the next. Can you hold that thought?
Yeah.
Because I think I'm going to cover it in the next topic.
Sounds good.
All right. It has to do with repository. Okay, so in my opinion, this value object is the building block of the building blocks. This value object pattern. What it is a small standalone object. We talked about standalone objects already. And the purpose of having it is for expression, and it's immutable. You can't change it once it's created. Which means it doesn't care about state. And not having to track state simplifies your code base. And all it is a small standalone object, and it helps to avoid primitive obsession. Let's talk about an example. So this is contrived. Me and ChatGPT came up with this code, but it's only partially dramatized. You'll recognize some of these terms. Now, what is this code trying to do? Okay, no one knows.
I'm actually trying to like zoom in to read it.
All right, let me zoom in a little bit more. It's punchline is not very clear what it's doing. So what is even happening? Testability is lacking, right? I don't understand this very easily. It says it's save, but what? Okay, save. So where's the save happening? Some other stuff's happening here.
Yeah, it looks like it's just gathering up errors.
Right. And I'm sure we've all seen code like this. This is not very uncommon.
Yeah, there is no save in there, is there?
All right. So now, yeah. Go ahead.
I just lost some hair. Yank.
All right. So here's what it looks like after the value object's been created for it. So now can you tell what's happening? It's the same code, but it's restructured because there's been an addition of a value object. So now we can clearly say, okay, no, wait, there are errors. There's some input validation or something happening with errors here. Then there's a qualification is fulfilled call. And then there's a database that I guess there's a save that happened with the database with this call, right? I don't know. This is what AI told me. But now it's a little bit clearer what's happening. There are 3 different things happening. 1, 2, 3. As opposed to up here, the same lines of code, but you can't really tell that there are 3 different things happening, right? Now here's the value object that produced this. Foundational qualification, and all it's doing is it wrapped the functionality relevant to a foundational qualification, and it calls it out explicitly. So the idea is it gives expressiveness, and it removes these lines, which are hiding somewhere in the mess. I don't even know where the lines are. I think 1, 2, 3, the returns. So that's the is fulfilled logic, encapsulated in foundational qualification. Now, when I read this, I'm like, oh, okay. Qualification is fulfilled, return true, right? So you have a much easier to understand code base. And also, can you imagine trying to test this? Where would you even test the is fulfilled logic? It's a little bit easier in this case to test it, but you still have to worry about the errors and you still have to worry about the database. In this case, I can test the fulfilled logic by itself, just by creating a test for that. And that is the, again, this is before we added it. That's the whole point behind a small standalone object that expresses the intent. This is that intention revealing interfaces thing again. And I said this was the foundational building block because every other object is just derived from this. And we'll see that next. The next one is entity. An entity is, to put it simply, is a value object that cares about ID, identification. That's all it is. It's defined by its ID. So if if you can define an object without an ID, it's not an entity. It's something else. An example is user.
It's a
Another
bug.
made up. Yeah, it's not one of these building blocks. At least it's
a bug.
it's a bug. It's a defect.
Yeah.
An example is this: you have a user. A user needs an ID because we're gonna have to track. So the ID, like, what is the ID? What does that mean? So the ID is the way that you can find and match objects. So here's an example. Let's say I user Drew and I have ID 1. There's another Drew. He has ID E2. So those are two different, but let's say the same name. I have every single other attribute is the same, but the IDs are different. That means they're two different objects. On the flip side, I can have ID 1, but it could be Drew, one could be Drew, one could be Olivia. But because the IDs are the same, those objects are quote unquote equal or the same. So if you have concepts like that in your domain, those are entity concepts. And separating your entities from your value objects are another example of making the implicit explicit and making your code clearer, easy to test. It goes deeper than this because in entities, things like managing invariants become important. Things that can't change, but we'll get into that. That gets a little bit more complicated to explain. These, I think, are the two most important objects or building blocks. But now to address the bigger topics. So remember that huge SQL query? The next building block covers that. Most likely, there's an aggregate hiding in that query, one or more aggregates. And an aggregate is this. So this is a grouping of, as you can see, values and entities under one root entity. So let's say there's an entity called user. And it's what's responsible for maintaining consistency of everything else within the aggregate boundary. So Brandon was talking about this example before when we talked about bounded context or side effects. It's like this user, if there's a method called, if there's an update, let's say an update method, I might need to touch a position, a group, and a manager object in order to fulfill that update. But if it's unbound and if it's just contained in a SQL query, how do we test it? We already know what that's like trying to test compliance. Now, what if it was bound? Then at least, so in this pattern, the root is responsible for the invariant checks, making sure that positions updated as it needs to be, manager, etc., and the atomicity. So make sure that each update or each operation, each behavior is atomic, right? So there's no confusion as to who's responsible, as to where the update is happening, as to how far in the process did it go, as to testing this. It's clear as to what's happening because everything is scoped within this aggregate structure. Chris?
Yeah, would an example of this be making sure that the database schema is designed correctly?
Okay, so we're getting the schema next.
Okay.
The answer would be no. Well, not directly, and I'll talk about that next. But any other questions about this? This is, I think, a really important one. Because we talked about standalone classes before. But, in real life, classes can't stand alone. You need collaborators on classes, and you need to talk to other classes. So the aggregate pattern handles that. User has to know about position, group, and manager, and this is the way to handle those dependencies.
Stand by.
Wait, was that Chris?
Stand by me.
Yeah, that. You mean like the old movie, right? Morgan Freeman?
Yeah, and the song.
That's my jam.
Otis Redding.
That's my jam, man.
Yeah.
All right, so Chris, here's your object. So the repository is another building block that lives in your model layer that needs to be protected. And it is the thing that helps you communicate with the infrastructure layer, but it does it in a way where it's decoupled from the infrastructure. And this is how. So let's say I don't have a code example, but let's say I have that same user. Let's say I have this user aggregate and I need to update it. I would have an object called user repository, and it would have an update method on it. Or I don't like, maybe update or add, right? To the caller, it would just look like a collection. So Ruby, what are Ruby collections called? Are they just like lists? In Java, it's like there's a collection, literally a collection class. There's like an array list class. What is it in Ruby? So whatever it is in Ruby, a collection.
I think it's lists and arrays, right?
Is it lists and arrays? So you would have an object called a repository object that would wrap. So it would kind of be a value object, right? But it would wrap that list. So if it was a user repository, it would be a list of, it would wrap a list of users. So the one attribute would be a user list, right? And then that method update, or it could be add, or it could be select or retrieve, get, they would return a list of a list of users. That's all it would do. So from a client of this repository, it's just returning you lists of the same model object called user, right? It just simplifies the interface completely. So I can now behind the scenes implement a connection to a database, to a file, to some file structure, to whatever it is behind the scenes. But as far as the model is concerned, the interface is that of a collection. And it just I've used it before, and it makes things so clean. Spring does a pretty good job in their interface. I don't know if Rails does it. It doesn't look like, well, I'm not aware. I'm new to Rails, but Active Record that definitely doesn't do it.
So
yeah.
from a Rails perspective, so I mean,
yeah,
you basically, in order to sort of practically express this repository, you'd have to create a model.rb basically that would define that class, define a class as a repository, basically, right?
You would say something like user repository,
right? So you would you could create a repository interface and then extend a user repository off of that, or you wouldn't
so because you wouldn't extend it. Oh yeah, this is another thing I didn't touch on. So these building blocks in Rails would be just poros. I think they call them poros. Pure plain old Ruby objects. So they wouldn't extend anything on Rails. Because yeah,
but if you're gonna have like duplicate methods, you wouldn't want to keep rewriting that, right?
Like you wouldn't have duplicate methods. How would you? And what? Give me some more on that.
Yeah, like a list or save or update.
So I can literally have, let's say this user object. Let's say I know all it's going to do is retrieve users. Let's I'm not going to do any updates. It's just all I'm going to interact with is everything I do to this database table is just going to be selects.
Okay.
Let's say, for example, so there's no complication. I can literally have a repository object that's a value object that wraps a list and it has one method on it named get.
Okay.
Or one method name, and all that get does or find all does is return all users.
So that I think goes back to my original question of like, this kind of negates the need for interfaces, abstract classes, and things like that. You're basically not going to be. There's no point in it. In other words,
in this case, you're right. In this case, actually, it's going more towards like composition and delegation. More than it's not going to inherit anything for this particular pattern. It's literally going to wrap a list. So let's come up with another position repository. I want to get all the positions from the DB. How do I do this? By protecting the model. Well, I have a position repository object. I wrap a list called positions, and I have a method called select all. And now within that method, the return value is a list of positions. And so the clients are just working with that plain old Ruby object. The complicated part is this now. So how do I actually interact with the database? And I want to set up a prototype for this when we have like a cleaner code base to do it, and I know a little bit more about Rails, but we can have another object and go into the other pattern, this record pattern. This is not specific to DDD, but it's useful because this is now your data model. So let's say this record now can extend. This will live in the infrastructure layer, not in the model layer. So this class can be, I can reference this class from the model, but I can't tie myself to it. One second, Brandon. So this can extend from active record, right? This can actually map to a table. And now what I can do with that is inject that into my repository as the implementation of the persistence. This would be better with an example, but I don't know if you follow me. Brandon, you got your hands raised.
Yeah, I'm gonna try and take a crack at explaining what you're talking about with an example.
Sure.
I think I can. So as an example,
1 second. While you do that, I'm going to take a quick bio break and be right back.
Okay. So let's say you want to test a controller, but you don't want to actually generate an HTTP request in. You don't want to tie into the database. You don't want to do all these things. Having a controller that you can, that says you pass in something that satisfies an interface. I no longer need an HTTP request. I can mock that or stub that. And then it doesn't actually need to reach out and talk to anything in the data layer. You can create something that mocks or stubs that piece of it as well. So the controller can be tested in isolation. You can simulate like invalid data. You can simulate timeouts. You can do all these types of things and see what the controller will do with those behaviors because you're specifically testing just the behavior of the controller. And I think that our, what are they called? Requests, specs are similar to that. But I think that Rails might have a little bit more coupling than is even desirable in some of those things. But anyway, that's a similar example. Like if I wanted to take my model and say, hey, simulate a timeout with the database, I want to be able to mock the data layer with this to be able to say, hey, the database connection timed out. Hey, the database read timed out, or whatever it did. And you need to be able to do that without actually connecting to the database, obviously. So I think that's one of these things that Drew's talking about with repository, or at least I think that's what he's talking about with a repository, is being able to do those types of things. Because like he was saying, you want to be able to simulate, do I get this data from the database? Do I get it from a file? Do I get it from a whatever? Those are, or do I want to get it from a test, right? I can have a test that mocks those particular attributes of that object. But Drew's not back yet, so now we're going to have dead air. I'll tell you, in Go we do this. Like there are things that let you simulate a backend call without needing to like do the spy on things where like you're intercepting stuff. You can just pass in the thing that you want to do that satisfies the data layer.
Yeah, those are all good points. And you brought up the test. Look, one of the primary purposes of these objects is to promote testability. Because now with an object like this, how would I test the repository? Well, it's easy. It's just a plain old Ruby object. All it does is there's a method called get or a method called update. It returns a list of objects, and I just have to verify that return value. I don't have to spin up a DB because it's decoupled from the DB. I don't have to implement any of that data if I don't want to test the database. Now, there might be some cases where I do want to test the actual database connection, but this allows you the option where you don't have to, but you could still execute the repository logic. And so, yep.
Sam and I ran into this very thing yesterday. He's like, I'm testing a form and I want to test the form. How come I have to stub a path, a bunch of get parameters, and a sidebar nav just to be able to do this? And I said, well, because the test is showing you that we haven't decoupled these things correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is, yeah.
Yep. And I guess, just even going through that exercise shows you real quick, I want to draw a form and test the validation on it and test the posting to the API.
Mm-hmm.
But here I am messing around with all these URL parameters, and it shows you very quickly, oh, you haven't separated these things at all.
Oh man, don't even get me started. The front end is even trickier than, so this is from the back end perspective. It's easier on the back end. The front end now, especially with Next, you get it's the case where your infrastructure is your view. Your infrastructure is the life cycle, the hooks. And so to decouple your model from that is tricky because it's very much tied into React and Next. There's a way to do it. Amber will tell you, like there's a view model that can be extracted from that, that can be tested separately. And that's the solution to that. But that's another topic. I want to make sure this point is understood. Any questions around this in particular? Because I think this is the way that we begin on the back end, on the Rails, to decouple from the active record. And yeah.
I do have one question, Drew.
Right.
So even our model extending active record sort of couples us with a negative side effect.
Oh, absolutely.
And I notice it too with Redis. Like when we go to launch things, it's like, oh, hey, I can't connect to Redis. And I'm running a test that is completely outside.
Yep.
But because of how we've extended and inherited and all this stuff, we end up needing to we're coupled to things that we don't even need to do when we want to run a single spec in isolation. So this is exactly the kind of stuff you're talking about.
Yes, exactly. So the testability, it makes the implicit explicit. It keeps things side effect free. Minimal dependencies, et cetera, et cetera.
So
independent, isolated, testable.
So test failing because of Sidekick, just not being able to keep up was a prime example of this.
Of a side effect and of being, yeah. It's like that analogy where you want one Lego block, but to get that Lego block, it's attached to the other Lego block. And that's attached to a whole Lego castle. So I just want one red Lego block, but I got to get the whole castle for that one block. And that's the coupling. That's the whole analogy.
That's the compliance query too.
That's the compliance query. Exactly. And this is what avoids that. That query is one or more of these things. Hiding in the query, hiding in that logic.
Yeah.
Or it might just be an entity. It might just be one of these that are, pretty complex, maybe a couple entities floating around. And anyway, so that to me, that would be the progression. Start with value objects. Well, first of all, start with layering, the idea of protecting your model. Value objects, build from that, get entities, build from that and group them into aggregates, and separate from DBs and external things using things like repositories, because this pattern can be followed. Let's say I have to call an email service. You can use the same type of pattern where you give that connection or that interaction with the mail server a simple interface that you interact with in your model, and you can implement that by injecting functionality into it. Yeah, and Chris, you were going to say something?
I mean, I'm just thinking, it's like I'm always trying to find practical examples for me to understand the concepts. And
yeah,
seems like it could be like a 4-hour exercise where we looked at that compliance core query and just pulled out, just identified what's going on there, in step by step, and
yeah,
and not even care about like how it affects anything else. Just look at that, and so we could identify exactly what's going on to basically bring out the hidden stuff.
Yeah, if possible. Just to call out the other ones, not going to spend too much time on these, but these are also objects that would live in your model. Factories are responsible for creating objects. That's making the creation explicit and isolated and testable. Service objects, you know how sometimes you have some functionality, but you don't know exactly where it lives within your current, where should I put this method? Sometimes you stick that in a service.
Yeah, I've done that where I just stick it into like a utils class or something.
Yeah, utils it could be an example of that type of service, but utils would probably be more infrastructure. The service is actually a concept in the model. That would be the difference. It's a concept in the model that you would call out, but they don't fit perfectly into any of the existing models. So you would call that in service. I talked about this before. This is not really a model. It's a building block, but it's not a model object. Modules are, I don't think this means the same thing in Rails, because I know Rails has a module keyword. But this is basically, it's like a folder or a package, and it just cohesively groups different classes. Cohesive defined by like group by behavior and group by domain concept, not by these are controllers, these are services, these are repositories, not that type of grouping, but group by, let's say this is compliance, this is tracking, that type of grouping, domain-driven grouping, if you will. Events and commands, translators, those are some other topics. These translate between two bounded contexts. So that KSAT might have a different shape in one context than another case at in another context. And that translation happens in these types of objects. So that functionality is explicitly called out and isolated again. So it's easy to test. Those are all the building blocks, guys. We really got a little, we got technical there, and I think I was excited to address some of these because it took us a little, down to earth. We were in the clouds, talking more abstract, philosophical, and more big picture concepts before. But this answers the question, how do you express this in the code? And I was excited to kind of talk about this today. And I could tell Chris and Brandon were into it. Olivia's into it too, but this is way too geeky for like Olivia's interest. I could tell.
I follow, but much more loosely.
Yeah, we got into the weeds here. And that's pretty much it. We've gone over the spirit of DDD, the 6 key components. Congratulations, everybody. Clap. Yay.
Yay.
And I just want to conclude by saying this, right? So now that we've gone through all of that, I would give this advice. Don't clip your toenails with hedge clippers. Tried it, it don't work.
What if that's all I have?
What?
If that's all you have?
Or you could
I would say keep the toenails.
Anything can be a toenail clipper if you're brave enough.
Or except that you might lose the toe.
Yeah, be careful. You might lose the toe. I say that to say, sorry, go ahead. Oh, I thought somebody was saying something. I say that to say, we don't need to have fully decked out DDD. And I don't think we should. I don't think personally that our business needs and our environment calls for that right now, or can handle that right now. I think we start with a base model DDD. And that's a good thing. DDD is not all or nothing. We could start off with what fits us. And here's a set of things I think fit us. Give me your opinion on these. First, adopt the vocabulary. I think it's a good idea for us to adopt the vocabulary, period, and mean the same things when we talk to each other. If I say a model object, but when Chris says model object, he means something else. It's the who's on what, who's on first, what's on second situation. So I think number one, what do you guys think? Number two, we got to get characterization tests set up where possible and worth it. My opinion, is it worth it to set it up on? Is the juice worth the squeeze in certain areas? I'm starting to give up on the some of the code in the back end. But I'm not going to dwell on that. But I think where it's worth it and where it's possible, set up characterization tests. Number three, refactor towards better layering, right? That layering concept again, and value objects. If we pick those two up, we'll be off to a good start. Sprout services where possible and worth it. I use this word. There's a pattern called Sprout class, and it just means start up a new class and stick behavior on the class. This will allow us to set things up on the side in the strangler pattern format. I don't know if we talked about that before, but it allows us to start to move away from the harder to test, harder to understand big ball of mud and expand functionality in a better way on the side. I think there's room for that. We're already doing that we're trying to do that in Central API. Correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, but I think that's the idea there. Did somebody raise their hand or was that me? No, okay. I think we should try test first for all new code according to the building blocks we just went over in supple design. And as far as the future academy talent and whatever else, we start thinking in terms of potential bounded context. And context mapping is something we didn't go over, but that as well. And then start experimenting with event storming during model exploration. This is just what event storming does is it helps directly give us, let's say, as a result of an event storming session, you'll end up with objects that you can add to your model and start to prototype with. So that's kind of why I'm partial to event storming. But I think we're already doing a good job with model exploration, but this is one of the techniques we can adopt. And I don't think I think our business and our situation calls for this. And I don't think it's beyond what we could do or beyond what we should do in terms of just considering the complexity we have and like the technical challenges that we have. We want to avoid this. I just like the pictures. Chris, what's up, man?
Is there
I think so.
is there potential ramifications for performance?
I think yes.
Too, but yeah, of course, security too. But I'm just like, I'm trying to wonder, you know, if we might come across something that could end up like we want to be domain driven as much as possible, but we might end up like sacrificing performance and security in the process or something. I don't know. I'm throwing things out there. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, so in general, not even DDD, but from just a design, the way I look at those things generally is like, let's say a requirement comes out right now regarding, like in our current state, there's a new security requirement, a new service level agreement requirement, a new performance requirement where this page is loading too slow or whatever the case may be. If that happens right now, and let's say we trace it back to, we're picking on compliance, but let's say compliance, or let's say we trace it back to somewhere in the reporting. How would we begin to even tune it? We don't know. It's hard enough trying to figure out what it's doing, much less to tune it.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Right.
The other part of this, Drew, is that when you do these domains and when you sort of you break apart your separation of concerns, right? Then you can have a better concurrency pattern anyway, right? So if like, hey, in this area, we're doing this particular database call 10,000 times. Well, because you have a concurrency pattern established, you can scale or separate that concern appropriately. Right now, it's coupled together, so you can't do that. I think that's one of the biggest thing about like what Drew's talking about that you can do is like you can say, hey, this particular part of our domain, we're doing this a lot. It's not very slow, but we're doing it a lot. Oh, we need to scale this in a certain way or, whatever. And how do we improve that without breaking everything else or having side effects and everything else?
To piggyback, Brandon, how do we make this save function faster?
Right, exactly. Move the validation out of it, right?
Right. Yeah, and then let's say the requirement is make save faster, or make save more secure. But save has multiple things going on that we can't identify.
Right.
When you do this, you start to identify it. But again, if I start to say, okay, make save faster, I still need to say, okay, which part of this is the bottleneck? It's still not clear. It's all together. But if I have something like this, I can make this section fast enough in isolation. And before even that, I can identify if this is the bottleneck.
You can profile the entire class and know which piece of it is taking time and what it's spending its time doing.
Right. That proxy, right? So we had those 4 design traits. So we had testability, simplicity, clarity, reversibility. That testability piece is kind of a proxy for other things. The testability piece is kind of the things that make the code testable also make it securable or optimizable in whatever direction you want to optimize it. If it's testable, it's always a good start. If it's not testable, it's a clue that any other ility that you throw at it is going to be really hard to optimize. So that's kind of where I stand with that, Chris. And that's why I like the emphasis on it. Hey, let's decompose the thing, split it apart, simplify it, make it testable is the priority before anything else. Because again, yeah, sure, business could come in and say, oh man, we have this new security, constraint. But in the shape it's in right now, I don't see how we can do it. I'm new. I leave it to like you, Sam, and Adam to speak up on this, but I don't see how it's easy to optimize in any way.
Yep. We have a concrete example of this. There's a library that we use in our data layer right now, and in Rails 7.2, it's there's not a version of the library that works for it, and so we're coupled now both by Rails and by this other gem that we chose to use, and we haven't separated our model from these 2 particular types of database interaction. and it puts us in a tough place. So this isn't even just speculative and hypothetical. This is, the apartment tenant gem, right? Yeah. That is coupled into our application in so many ways right now. And the same thing's true of this, I don't know what it's called, but the thing that handles soft deleting records, right? It's the same type of thing there, where we kind of get this side effect behavior, but we have it coupled right into our models to the point where we can't even maintain and do basic maintenance on our code base.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I totally agree with you, Brandon. And Drew, for the sake of this, obviously I've been pretty quiet during this general demonstration, but I think it's because I'm kind of bought into the whole domain-driven design thing. Yeah, I think by and large, refactoring slowly and iteratively is going to, not slowly, but iteratively is going to be our key to victory here, especially because we have more applications coming down the pipe soon.
Yeah,
where we're really going to have to start defining what our domains are and potentially even breaking models we have in the Cyberstar domain out into a more shared domain that can be leveraged across like applications, whether it's the central API or some other mechanism where we just have a more organized approach in general, on top of the fact that as we write code, I think it's really going to force us to make it more test driven anyways by default, which I'm looking forward to as well, because something Drew and I have been kind of messing with in terms of like the DCWF scrapers. Like, it's really hard to even test at the moment because the scraper itself is tied directly into our data model from Cyberstar, so we can't even really break that out cleanly yet without refactoring anyway. So I think as time goes on and we start just developing more patterns as a team, we'll be it'll be a better spot. It'll make everything substantially easier to going forward.
Yeah, good points, man. I'm glad. So again, base model, I don't think this is overwhelming at all. I think like you guys all agree.
And yeah, and honestly, going towards the base model will get us closer to the more luxury editions, anyways, right? Where we're we just need to get our foot in the door. Let's just get some kind of paradigm in place, that we all agree on, and that's working for us, and then just keep building on top of that. And especially if the team does start growing, having any of these types of things in place ahead of time, I think is going to be hugely helpful, especially if we do hit a spurt of growth at any point this year.
Exactly.
Is this something that is, do we need to add domain-driven design to our
agreements?
What's that?
Team agreements?
Well, that too, but I was thinking job descriptions, like if we're trying to hire people in, that they might have that experience already. So, because otherwise we're going to have to keep doing these workshops.
I think having it in the nice to have, Chris, makes sense. For me, this is one of those things where we can teach somebody how to do this. So if someone has the skill sets and the right attitude, maybe not even in that order, if they have the right attitude and the correct skill set, I'm even willing to go through this exercise as many times as it takes, versus it's like if someone doesn't know how to use Git, I don't really care. I'll teach you how to use Git as long as you're a strong developer. It's the same thing in my mind with domain driven and test driven, mostly because test driven is something that I've learned about, but is really something new that I've been using in the last couple months. So I think it'd be one of those things as a nice to have in the resume that it definitely would set someone apart from a candidate perspective. So I think that we should add it to the job descriptions, but not make it mandatory, if that makes sense.
I agree with that. Yeah, nice to have. Yeah. Look, if a candidate understands design in general and understands this graph and what the implications of this mean, and I don't think calling out DDD is necessary, but design, yes, like coupling.
Especially at the senior level, Drew. I don't know about you, but I feel like at the senior level, you should definitely have some instincts for design, and you may not even know. I don't know all the vocab words for things.
Oh, absolutely.
But I definitely want to see a proof of that they know what they're doing, whether that's the code challenges that we've been using or just we get better at asking questions as time goes on. Because Chris, I definitely agree that if every single time we have a new influx of developers, if none of them know what's going on, it might be a little more challenging. But I think just by and large, I don't want it to be ever mandatory, just because I always feel like I personally am very bad at vocab words when it comes to this kind of stuff. So as long as they have the fundamentals, we can teach them the rest.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. Ideally, though, I'd be like, yep, DDD, XP, TDD, BDD. But I mean, yeah. Realistically, I don't even know how you would find that guy anyway.
Yeah, a Rails developer who's good at DDD, TDD.
The next JS guy, and I would want that guy.
Yeah, it'd be ideal, obviously, but then I don't want to end up making the job description a unicorn as well.
Yeah, but Chris, that's a good point. I think
it is.
Chris is talking about just direction, trying to go in the right direction in terms of team, because that's important too. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason we kind of that I pointed out the base model is because, first of all, myself, I'm new to Rails. So if I wanted to implement, let's say, a repository pattern, and I wanted it fully decked out, right? I wanted the luxury model. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't be able to do it as well as I would want to, because I'm not as familiar with Rails as, let's say, Java. In Java, I've done it, but I wouldn't know where to start, and I don't know how Active Record works well enough. I don't know the quirks well enough to even execute it. So I'd have to work with you guys, to help me with Rails and things like that. So base model it up. I wouldn't be able to do that. So,
and there will be some challenges with the DDD stuff, just because I agree, Drew. My experience has been from the .NET side of the world, which is honestly very similar to Java. So I feel like at least .NET lends itself very well to this type of design pattern. And because even just bare low level, Ruby doesn't have a typing system. So sharing models can be challenging because there is no exact, I don't know. You can't be super specific on things. You have to enforce it with different mechanisms. And I agree, Brendan. I think we're approaching probably the cusp of I think everybody's time here.
Yeah.
So thanks, Drew. I really appreciate the overall presentation. I hope everyone else got a lot of value out of it as well.
Yeah, good to hear, Adam. And I hope so too. I've definitely taken advantage of the extra time that we had. But let me just end by saying this is the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more. It goes a lot deeper down the rabbit hole. I mean, even within the topics we discussed, there's a lot more to it. I gave the simplest definition I could, given the time span, but there's more to it, right? So I invite everyone to pick up that book or invite, have a chat with me. Come to my desk, come to my tree stump. And I'd be happy to geek out over this stuff, and not just geek out, but actually start to explore the code base to see where we could fit these building blocks in.
Yeah, that was the next thing I was going to say, Drew. Was
Yeah.
Let's put some feet to this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And just
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Yeah, look at all the different blocks here we're talking about, and see if we can identify anything that might already be that might already fit into these things, and then the ones that don't, then we could kind of narrow, focus in on those things to try to get them to fit in.
Yeah. Or bound them, right? Because you can bound by quality too. Like if that part of your code is like, okay, I'm not touching it. Okay, that's a bounded context. We'll do what we need to do over here, using the right building blocks. So yeah, if anybody, invite anybody, I'm always down to do this type of thing. So yeah, thanks for participating in the 3 sessions. I'm gonna put this content up on in our developer workspace so everybody can review it. Yeah, just ping me if any more questions, guys. And thank you. Have a good rest.
Thank you, Drew. See ya.
Thanks, Drew.
All right, man. Thanks.
Have a great day.